So, the title of my talk for today is From Whence Came the Land of Rus, A Brief History of the Sources and Scholars of the Rus Primary Chronicle. As Anastasia kindly mentioned, this is research that actually came from my first book, The Liturgical Past in Byzantium and Early Rus. And the topic is a medieval chronicle and its sources. This may sound pretty boring, but it is a subject that resonates beyond time. If you don't believe me, just ask Vladimir Putin. For over a decade, the Russian president has demonstrated a preoccupation with some of the contents of the Rus Primary Chronicle. It figured prominently, for example, in his speech in March 2014 when he defended the annexation of Crimea. And so great is the president's interest in his namesake that in 2016 he presided over the dedication of a 70-foot statue of Prince Vladimir on Borovitskaya Ploshchad, just outside the walls of the Kremlin. And I have an article entirely devoted to why this statue is there if anybody's interested in it. So you can look into that. As recently as just this past week, on January 7th, 2025, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow claimed that Saint Vladimir, who's really kind of the star of the Rus Primary Chronicle, he said, Saint Vladimir was the founder of our Rus, our government, of those who defend our fatherland with swords in their hands, and he has now become the symbol of the gathering of Russian lands. So, as these few examples make clear, even today in the 21st century, the Chronicle's tales are directly relevant to current events. They become instruments of international policy, cited to justify actions in the present, such as the brutal and bloody invasion of Ukraine. They are foundation myths of national origins and geopolitical identities. These stories were devised nearly 1,000 years ago, yet they remain powerful. As the eminent Cambridge historian Simon Franklin has said, they continue to create meanings for millions of people. They are not ancient curiosity, but living myths. But what are these living myths and where did they come from? How did they originate and who first wrote them down? Have the earliest manuscripts survived? If not, what materials have survived and how do scholars study them? These are some of the questions that we will explore together today. So what stories does the Rus Primary Chronicle contain? Well, it begins with an undated apocryphal tale of Noah dividing the earth among his three sons after the biblical flood. There follows a lengthy ethnic history in which the Rus and the Slavs are claimed to have descended from the line of Japheth, Noah's third son. With this biblical lineage established, the chronicle gradually begins to narrow its focus, first to various Slavic tribes, then to the Polyania of the Kiev region, and eventually to the family who came to rule them all, the Rurikids. Interestingly, this change from ethnic history to dynastic history is accompanied by a change in form, which you see here, this blue arrow that I've added, superimposed on the picture of the Laurentian Codex. So beginning in the mid-9th century, the chronicle shifts from continuous narrative to annals, a format in which events are recorded chronologically year by year. The annals portray the founding events of the medieval Kievan state, the invitation of Rurik and his kin, the Rus, to rule over the scattered Slavic tribes in and around Novgorod, their advance southwards along the way of the Varangians to the Greeks, and the establishment of the dynasty in Kiev, the continued expansion of the state during the reign of the warrior prince Sviatoslav, and the War of Succession following his death and the enthronement of Vladimir as Grand Prince of Kiev. If the first 100 years of annals depict the rise of Rus, the second 100 years depict the central episodes of its Christianization. These include stories such as the baptisms of Olga in Constantinople, the baptism of Rus under Vladimir in 988, the martyrdom of Princes Boris and Gleb, and the flowering or golden age of Christian culture in the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, as well as the founding of the Monastery of the Caves. The final half-decade of the Chronicle describes a period of decline. The land of Rus is repeatedly beset by rivalries within the princely family and by threats of invasion from without. Here, the entries assume an increasingly moralistic tone, as the Chronicle appeals to the warring branches of the dynasty to unite and forestall the ruin of Rus. In sum, the Rus Primary Chronicle contains two distinctive myths about the House of Rurik. The first is a myth of national origins, in which Rurik and his kin establish a powerful Varangian dynasty in Kiev. The second is a myth of Christian origins, in which their successors secure the eternal salvation of that land by accepting and spreading the Byzantine faith. So that, in brief, very brief, is the contents of the chronicle. So now let's turn to the texts themselves. The manuscript we are talking about today has been called by many names. At various times and in various places, it has been known as the Chronicle of Nestor, the Primary Chronicle, the Russian Primary Chronicle, the Kievan Primary Chronicle, the Tale of Bygone Years. And in more recent years, some scholars, including myself, have been started calling it in English the Rus Primary Chronicle to avoid connotations of nationalism. So this uncertainty around the title is largely the result of the chronicle's long and complex textual history. There is not a library or archive anywhere in the world that possesses an early medieval manuscript bearing any of the names that you see on this slide. There is not a surviving literary artifact from the early Middle Ages, in other words, that looks like this critical edition from 1950 that I have pictured here, this wonderful Soviet edition of it. What exists, rather, is a vast collection of much later codices dating from the late 14th to the 17th centuries. All of these surviving texts, some of which you see here, begin with a nearly identical story, a tale of bygone years, of whence came the land of Rus and who first began to rule in it. There are 5 main manuscript witnesses of this foundational account. The oldest of these is the Laurentian Codex, which was compiled for Prince Dmitry Konstantinovich of Suzdal in 1377. It is followed by the Hypatian Codex, a collection of chronicle entries copied around 1425, possibly in the city of Pskov. And next there is the I always mispronounce this. Next there's the Radziwill Codex, the earliest extant illustrated chronicle, renowned for its more than 600 colorful miniatures and datable to the 1490s. So one way to think of these codices is to imagine a matryoshka, right? Which we all know. Like these famous Russian nesting dolls, the chronicles contain far more hidden intricacy than first meets the eye. Each manuscript is a compilation of previous compilations. The extant text comprises earlier texts, which themselves comprise still earlier texts, and on down the line. The history of these manuscripts is therefore fantastically complicated and very often confounding. Consider once more the Laurentian Codex, a book comprising 173 parchment leaves written in vermilion and black ink. Its first 40 pages are the work of an unknown monk who wrote in the most ancient Cyrillic letters using a broad single column, which is what you see there. The remaining 130 folios were executed in 2 columns by the monk Lavrenti, whose name appears in the concluding colophon. He began copying the text in January 1377, possibly in Nizhny Novgorod, and he finished his labor 3 months later. So now let us watch as the matryoshka is unpacked. Scholars generally agree that Lavrenti copied his manuscript from a compilation made in Tver in 1305 for Prince Vladimir Yaroslavich. This 1305 compilation was itself a continuation of a series of manuscripts produced for the princes of Rostov between 1229 and 1281. The scribes in Rostov were drawing, in turn, on a series of compilations made in Vladimir from 1177 to 1212 for Prince Andrei Bogolubsky and his successors. Bogolubsky's bookmen, for their part, composed these copies using late 12th century chronicle records from the southern Rus city of Peroslavl south. These records were based on a chronicle compilation made at least 50 years earlier in the monasteries of nearby Kiev. It is this set of chronicle entries dating to the 2nd decade of the 12th century, which we refer to today as the Rus Primary Chronicle. So think about this for a moment. Quarter of a millennium, 5 cities, at least 9 generations of princely lines, and no fewer than 10 different chronicle compilations. It is enough to disorient perhaps even the most devoted of specialists, and yet I've only described in the broadest of terms the period of the chronicle's formation on which scholars more or less agree. Our matryoshka has still not reached its end, its innermost core. In fact, for many scholars of the Rus Primary Chronicle, it has only just started to reveal the layers hidden within. because it is not the surviving manuscripts that have interested most scholars over the past 250 years, but rather the question of what came before them. What did the original Rus historiographical documents look like? Who composed them and when? Were chronicle compilations made in Kiev before the 12th century, and if so, how many? What source materials did the first Kievan scribes have at their disposal, and how did they use them? These are the questions that have preoccupied scholars since the chronicles of Rus began to be critically studied during the Enlightenment. In the 250 years since, all manner of bewildering and contradictory theories have been put forward. Thousands upon thousands of pages have been written on hypothetical texts and their hypothetical authors. Nearly as many pages have been written in reaction and opposition to such speculations. If academic fixations are often referred to as cottage industries, the study of the Primary Chronicle is nothing less than a military industrial complex. That's an attempt at chronicle humor there. So what I'm saying is a complete survey of the enormous secondary literature is obviously impossible. And in what follows in this brief talk, I'm going to focus on the career of two main figures, one who is usually forgotten, and the other who is the singular giant of the field. The story begins in a perhaps unlikely place. We shall travel back to the mid-18th century, to a time when modern philological practices were still virtually unknown among Russia's intellectual and academic elite. Here, in the salons of the imperial capital, we will focus on a confident and talented foreigner, a noted scholar and polymath, determined to leave his mark on the study of ancient letters, both in Russia and far beyond. The man's name was August Ludwig von Schlötzer. And if my German accent is terrible, there's going to be a lot of German names here in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So if there are any Germans listening, please forgive me. So on November 22nd, 1761, Schlötzer arrived in St. Petersburg after a hazardous 3-month journey by sea. The 26-year-old linguist had traveled from his native Germany at the invitation of Gerhard Friedrich Müller, the ethnographer, historian, and co-founder of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He had immigrated to the northern capital 3 decades earlier. One evening after tea, the senior scholar conducted his new colleague upstairs to his office, where he pointed to vast stacks of manuscripts, all awaiting academic study, which he had collected during his famous travels across Siberia and European Russia. Here, there is enough work to occupy you and me and dozens of others for a whole lifetime, Müller told his compatriots. Few were as qualified for this kind of philological labor as Schlötzer. A descendant of 3 generations of Protestant clergymen, the young polyglot had mastered Latin, Greek, and Hebrew while still a schoolboy. After reading theology in Wittenberg, he had studied geography and Near Eastern languages at the University of Göttingen, where he trained in the methods of biblical criticism pioneered by his mentor, Johann David Michaelis, who you see pictured here. Such methods were utterly unknown in Catherine's Russia. In Göttingen, we were accompanied to a painstaking, thorough method of work, Schlötzer later wrote in his autobiography. How sharply this contrasted with the careless method, more careless than even the superficial French method, with which they treated all literary subjects in St. Petersburg. Schlötzer never intended to devote himself to the study of Old Russian history, as the medieval period was called at that time. He originally envisaged his journey in Russia as merely the first leg of a much greater overland voyage to Inner Asia, where he planned to continue his research on the language and literatures of the Orient. These plans were eventually abandoned, however, as Schlötzer became increasingly engrossed in the study of modern Russian and Old Church Slavonic. He found the latter language particularly fascinating, going so far as to describe it as the best language for translating Homer. The more he studied the ancient tongue, moreover, the more he found himself drawn to the earliest specimens of Rus historiography. My heart was inclined above all towards Russian chronicles, he explained. Müller, so his host, employed him to work on modern topics, such as geography and statistics, but the ambitious young researcher persisted in asking for access to the chronicle manuscripts. All around me, I saw an abundant harvest, untouched by the sickle, Schlötzer later recalled, and no one but me could harvest it so soon. To be the first publisher and commentator of the chronicles of the most populous, most powerful, and most formidable country in Europe, Was it truly possible to consider that a trifling matter? Schlitzer was alarmed by the state of Russian chronicle studies. No one in the capital seemed to be aware of the extensive philological research required to understand these materials properly. Even Schlitzer's host, the highly esteemed Mueller, was in the habit of treating the sources like a collection of ready made facts, available to scholars without any consideration of their textual history. The newcomer instantly perceived the limitations of such an approach, and he resolved to study medieval chronicles in the same fashion that his professors in Germany were studying the songs of Homer and the epistles of St. Paul. It was a plan that would indeed prove to be a task of a lifetime, just as his senior colleague had once suggested. In 1767, Schlitzer returned to Germany to take up a professorship at his alma mater. For the next 30 years, he continued his investigations into the origins of East Slavic history writing. Finally, in the early years of the 19th century, he published a work that many of his contemporaries lauded as the first modern critical edition of a medieval European chronicle. This was his magnum opus, which would be translated into English as something like Nestor, Russian Annals in their Slavonian basic language, compared, translated, and explained by August Ludwig Schlitzer. So the title of the 5-volume study was revealing. It highlighted both the critical nature of the study and the author's belief that a single monk named Nestor was responsible for writing the full text of the First Kievan Chronicle. Such a notion was widespread in Russia at the time, so much so that the work was typically referred to as the Chronicle of Nestor. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, Schlitzer managed to examine 21 redactions of Nestor, as he was in the habit of calling the text. During that time, he became increasingly convinced that there was a major problem with the surviving manuscripts. The earliest folios he had before him were from the Hypatian Radziwill codices, which dated from the 15th century, not the 11th. He was therefore reading not the original pristine work of Nestor, but versions that had been deformed and distorted by nearly 4 centuries of transmission. The linguist was utterly certain where to assign the blame. The guilty parties were the, quote, wretched and simple-minded clerics who had copied these texts. Like his teacher Michaelis, Schlitzer found all manner of fault with these, quote, ignorant monks of the Middle Ages. It was they who had introduced stupid mistakes and fabrications, nonsense, and miracles into the manuscripts. Schlitzer considered it his duty as an editor to excise such errors and decretions. He believed that by painstakingly comparing all the redactions, letter by letter, word by word, he could overcome centuries of cover the original composition. With the publication of Nestor in 1802, Schlitzer was confident he had accomplished exactly that. If there is anything important in this book, he wrote, it is, of course, the reconstruction of Nestor's original words. Critics hailed this reconstructed text as a major breakthrough. Before Schlitzer, a critical approach to the Chronicles was completely absent, one reviewer explained. By analyzing the text of a chronicle as if it were a page from the Bible, he had, quote, therefore accorded the Chronicle of Nestor a kind of respect never before shown to any other ancient chronicle, end quote. The suggestion here is that Schlitzer was the first scholar to study medieval chronicles like a professional linguist and philologist. Remarkably, this was true not only for Russia, but indeed for all of Europe. It would be another 60 years before Gaston Perry adopted a similar approach to his studies of Western medieval texts. Schlitzer's work was thus truly pioneering. He was the first to search for earlier sources, the first to employ a comparative linguistic methodology, and the first to reconstruct a hypothetical text. His career anticipated the course of chronicle studies in both Russia and the West for centuries to come. Yet for all of his advances, Schlitzer was still very much a product of his age. Nowhere is this more apparent than in his attitude towards Nestor the chronicler. Throughout his, who you see here in this miniature from the Radziwill Codex. So throughout his writings, Schlitzer depicts this figure as the lone fountainhead of all early Rus historiography. Nestor is the first, most ancient, and only native source of the most ancient history until 1054, Schlitzer wrote. So there is no place in Schlitzer's scheme for previous compilations or earlier texts and authors. There was only Nestor, the ideal abstract chronicler, before whom there was no native chronicle writing, and after whom came only distortions and corruptions. Such a notion of authorship passed down from teacher to student was one of the great errors of the Göttingen school of history. Yet it would be corrected just before the close of the century by one of the school's own products, iconoclastic Friedrich August Wolff. In his now classic study from 1795, Prolegomena ad Homerem, Wolff challenged many of the most fundamental assumptions of Enlightenment-era textual criticism. Perhaps most brazenly, he advanced the idea that there had never been a blind bard named Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not the creation of a single poet, the scholar argued, but rather the combined work of multiple rhapsodists, separated in time by hundreds of years. These ancient singers had originally composed independent poems, which were only later stitched together to form the surviving texts. Thus, where his predecessors had seen the work of a solitary mythmaker, Wolff perceived a much longer tradition of writing, collecting, editing, and copying. This revolutionary notion marked the beginning of a new movement in philological thought, one that would knock not only Homer from his pedestal, but eventually Nestor as well. We should not imagine banners of revolt flying over the Russian Academy of Sciences at this time, however. As was so often the case with European intellectual trends, Wolff's ideas began to emerge in Russian scholarship only much later, after a delay of several decades. The first to adopt them for the study of chronicles was a Muscovite historian and bibliographer, Pavel M. Stroyev, in his preface to the Sophia Chronicle from 1821. Drawing heavily on Wolff's insights, Stroyev put forward a fundamentally new conception of chronicle writing in early Rus. He hypothesized that yearly chronicle entries, based on observations of local eyewitnesses, had been kept in various towns and princedoms from a very early date. These original records were later lost, but not before they were reworked by later scribes far removed from the actual events. Like Schleutzer before him, Stroyev did not share a particularly high opinion of these monastic bookmen. In his estimation, they were, quote, ignorant compilers who had thoughtlessly and mechanically combined several separate earlier chronicles into much larger zborniki, or compilations, the oldest of which was the Laurentian Codex. Stroyev's conception of these zborniki was very different from that of his predecessors. They were not the work of a single hand, but many. They contained materials not from one time and place, but from many locales and periods. This observation may seem obvious from a modern vantage point, but at the time it was pathbreaking. With a single term, zbornik, Stroyev had provided the key to a profoundly new understanding of what chronicles comprised and how they developed their extant form. Such a change in perception naturally entailed a change in the methods and goals of scholarship. For Schleutzer, the main problem had been determining how later copyists had deformed the text after its original composition in the early 12th century. For Stroyev and his successors, the principal issue, rather, was determining what sort of source materials had existed before the text was compiled and how those materials had been incorporated into the surviving manuscripts. Thus was born one of the pillars of modern Russian and Ukrainian chronicle studies, Источниковедение, or source criticism. The great hunt for the sources of the Rus Primary Chronicle had begun. Four scholars writing and publishing in the mid-19th century deserve special mention in this regard. In 1836, Vasily Perivoshikov, so that's the gentleman all the way to the left on your screen, he became the first to doubt in print that Nestor was responsible for the most ancient chronicle records. He suggested that various attitudes, differences in tone, and narrative exposition made it possible to distinguish the work of multiple earlier chroniclers. 3 years later, in 1839, the son of an emancipated serf, Mikhail Pagodin, that's the handsome devil in the middle there, he also detected internal textual evidence of previous records. He argued against Schleitzer's view that Nestor had relied exclusively on Byzantine sources and oral traditions, positing that the first chronicler had also drawn on earlier ecclesiastical or monastic records, local folk songs, Viking legends, and various Bulgarian materials. A similar argument was advanced nearly a quarter of a century later by Ismail Srezhnevsky, who's all the way on the right. He was the dean of philology at St. Petersburg University, and he suggested that chronicle notes, comparable to the annals of Western Europe, had been kept continuously in Rus since the early 10th century. These notes were written down in the margins of Paschal tables, the scholar claimed, after which they were merged with ancient oral traditions about the earliest Slavs. A contemporary of Srezhnevsky's, Konstantin Bestuzhev-Rumin, likewise perceived the chronicle as a combination of constituent parts. He believed these elements were originally composed at princely courts throughout Rus and were only later sewn together into a unified work. The extant manuscripts appeared contradictory and heterogeneous, therefore, not simply because later monks had made errors in interpolations. Rather, the texts survived in that condition because they had been compiled from heterogeneous and contradictory sources to begin with. The Chronicle is an encyclopedic work, an archive, the Russian nobleman explained, in which traces of the earliest native literature are preserved. Bestuzhev-Rumin envisaged this archive as housing two different kinds of written materials, earlier annals and what he called independent tales. In summary, by the close of the 1860s, chronicle studies in Russia had clearly made significant strides. The notion of the extant text as one man's masterpiece in need of restoration had given way to a rather different idea. The surviving text was now treated like a patchwork quilt, and the task of the philologist was to find its seams, the places in the manuscripts where one tale had been stitched together with another. This brand of scholarship, pioneered by Bestuzhev-Rumin, proved very popular. Throughout the late 19th century, various chronicles were dissected into a multitude of parts, using a wide variety of competing and often contradictory criteria. The methods of textual fragmentation had, by all appearances, triumphed over those of textual reconstruction. But just when it seemed that the dream of a pristine original text had been abandoned, a new series of groundbreaking papers began to appear in St. Petersburg. These works combined the insights of 19th century Istochnika Videnia with a sprawling, all-encompassing comparative approach, not unlike that of Schlotzer's from 100 years earlier. Their author was also a young linguist and polymath, trained in the traditions of German scholarship, and eager to change the prevailing view of early Rus historiography. Yet, unlike Schlotzer, this powerful new thinker was not content merely to reconstruct Nestor's original words. He was determined, above all, to reconstruct the words of chroniclers who had lived and worked decades before Nestor ever took up a pen. The name of this towering figure in the history of the field is Alexei Shakhmatov, a philologist and historian who is generally seen as the father of modern Russian textology. Shakhmatov pioneered the comparative historical method of chronicle studies in a series of articles written between 1896 and 1920. He seems to have imagined himself as something like an archaeologist. But rather than finding concrete objects in the ground, the linguist recovered layer after layer of earlier hypothetical svodi from the extant manuscripts. Using an array of etymological, phonetic, grammatical, orthographic, literary, political, and historical criteria, he meticulously charted out the evolution of long-lost chronicle compilations and attempted to reconstruct their original contents. These labors culminated in 1908 with the release of his monumental, I'll give the name in English here, English translation, Investigations into the Most Ancient Russian Chronicle Compilations. That's the text you see on the left of your slide there. This monograph was greeted by many contemporaries as the single most significant and revolutionary publication in the history of chronicle studies, a reputation which it continues to enjoy in some Russian academic circles even to the present day. Shakhmatov followed up with several additional major works on early Rus historiography. Foremost among these was a reconstructed edition of the chronicle text published in 1916, as well as another study composed in the same year, The Tale of Bygone Years and Its Sources, which you see on the right there. Where am I? Okay. This later work did not appear in print until 1940, however, exactly 2 years after the scholar's tragic death from hunger and exhaustion in the years following the Russian Revolution. Okay, so the key to understanding the so-called revolution of Shakhmatov starts with the idea of a svod. We are dealing here not simply with a change in terminology, but with a fundamental shift in thinking about the nature of chronicles, the history of their compilation, and the motivations behind their meaning and their making. Before Shakhmatov, the reigning interpretive model, as we just saw, was that of the Sbornik, championed by Stroyev, Bestujev, Ramin, and their late 19th century followers. These thinkers had postulated the existence of earlier annals, independent written tales, Byzantine documents, and oral legends, but they generally treated the extant text of the Rus Primary Chronicle as the first collection of all such materials. Shakhmatov turned this chronology on its head. He believed that comparative analysis of the surviving manuscripts proved the existence of earlier, fully realized non-extant chronicle redactions. In his view, the earliest stages of Kievan chronicle writing did not begin with the making of the Rus Primary Chronicle, but rather ended with it. The extant text was not the first link of the chain. It was the final link in a succession of svodi reaching back deep into the 11th century. So how should we understand this term svod? Or, redaction might be the closest English translation. So for Shakhmatov, these were certainly not annals, which were kept continuously and gradually accumulated over time, nor were they archives of various sources or copies of earlier compilations. For Shakhmatov, the making of a svod was something far more dynamic and subjective than any of these previous conceptions. In his view, every time a cleric sat down to write a new redaction, he was performing a decisive and creative editorial act. The history writers of early Rus were not merely copyists or collectors. They were astute observers who crafted specific versions of the past for specific political reasons. They were author editors who considered carefully all the materials at their disposal and then judiciously reshaped them into an original narrative expressing a particular ideological viewpoint. The term svod therefore signified not only a new conception of chronicles, but also a new conception of chroniclers. No longer were these men imagined as prayerful clerics corded off from the vanities and intrigues taking place outside the monastery walls. On the contrary, in the hands of Shakhmatov, the chronicler was transformed, in the words of his disciple Dmitry Pisokov, the chronicler was transformed into, quote, an experienced writer official in the political chancellery of the prince. He was now the ruler's official apologist and an obedient executor of his orders to rework public opinion from an ideological perspective, end quote. Thus, it was in the writings of Shakhmatov that contemporaries encountered for the first time a conception of early Rus historiography that was more or less modern. The writing of history was perceived as malleable, constructed, and politically motivated. The tools and methods of the linguist and philologist were combined with those of the historian and political theorist. The final result was a radically new picture of chronicle writing in 11th century Rus, one that was as precarious and hypothetical as it was exhilarating and unprecedented. So the basic contours of Shakhmatov's scheme are well known, at least if you study this stuff for a living. He maintained that 3 redactions of the Rus Primary Chronicle were made in Kiev in the early 12th century. The first was written by Nestor at the Monastery of the Caves in 1113. The second was written by the abbot Sylvester at St. Michael's Monastery in 1116, and the third by an anonymous monk of the caves in 1118. Unlike his predecessors, however, Shakhmatov did not view these redactions as the original compilation. Rather, while comparing them with another early chronicle source, the younger recension of the Novgorodian First Chronicle, Shakhmatov came to the conclusion that there was a common source text underlying both manuscript traditions. The philologists called this hypothetical text the Nachalny Svod, or the beginning compilation, and dated its creation to the middle of the 1090s. Upon closer examination, however, the Nachalny Svod also showed signs of being compiled. It too contained numerous interpolations, duplications, and contradictions. There were errors in chronology, grammar, and syntax. Certain passages contained differing lexicons, phraseologies, and authorial sympathies. Such inconsistencies led Shakhmatov to conclude that there was a still older svod underlying the beginning compilation. He attributed this layer to the pen of Nikon, an abbot of the Caves Monastery, and placed the date of its composition at 1073. Yet even this hypothetical predecessor of a hypothetical predecessor was not the final link in the chain. The scholar continued to find seams, insertions, and incongruities. He therefore proposed the existence of a still earlier chronicle layer, the Drevnейший Kievsky Svod, or in English, the most ancient Kievan compilation of 1039. Shakhmatov imagined this document as the narrative core upon which all later Kievan chronicle writing was founded. He suggested its authors were clerics at the newly built Cathedral of St. Sophia, who had been directed to write the first native history by the new Greek metropolitan, Theopempt, a hierarch only recently arrived from Constantinople. In his magnum opus, Investigations, Shakhmatov even presented a full reconstruction of this pristine, original, and completely hypothetical text. Thus, by comparatively investigating manuscripts of much later provenance, Shakhmatov arrived at a number of strikingly precise conclusions about the historiography of early Rus. Some of these were based on philological and linguistic data, others on historical and political speculations, and still others on a combination of the two. The dating of the compilations is a good example of this tendency. The years 1113, 1093, 1073, and 1039 were hardly chosen at random. Each was connected to a major political event in Kievan history, an event which Shakhmatov viewed as the catalyst for the making of a new chronicle. The most common catalyst was the accession of a new grand prince or the consecration of a new cathedral or church hierarch. Shakhmatov's system was more than a purely philological exercise. It was also political. Yet similar to Schlotzer a century before him, the linguist's ultimate goal remained the reconstruction of long-lost original sources. Everything else, the hypothetical dates and authors and political situations, was only a means to that end. Real texts in themselves did not interest Shakhmatov, explains Varvara Vavina Lebyedova. They appealed to him only as raw materials, which he could use to penetrate through time and behold Svodi. And by the way, for those of you out there who read Russian, Varvara Vavina Lebyedova has written an amazing book on the history of the study of the Rus Primary Chronicle. And actually, a lot of the stuff that I'm saying in this presentation draws on research she has done. So it's important to credit her for that. All right, let me find where I was. Okay, so particularly telling in this respect is that Shakhmatov considered his crowning achievement to be the text appended to the conclusion of his magnum opus, Investigations. Historiography that even Schlotzer could scarcely have imagined. Not the restored text of Nestor, nor even the beginning compilation of the 1090s, but rather two fully reconstructed versions of the Nikon Svod and the most ancient Kievan Svod. It was nothing short of a philological miracle. A scholar in 20th century St. Petersburg, working with texts from 14th century Suzdal and 15th century Novgorod, had reconstructed the original historical record of 11th century Kiev. Reactions to Shakhmatov's program have been diverse and deeply divided. On one end of the spectrum, there are those who view his theories as truly revolutionary break with all that preceded them. Scholars in this camp treat Shakhmatov's system of svodi as the defining discovery in the history of the field, illuminating the path ahead for all future generations. At the other end of the spectrum are those who maintain serious doubts about Shakhmatov's discoveries. Members of this camp are skeptical of his fundamental premises and unconvinced by his elaborate deductive proofs. They also reject the notion that chronicle studies were born, like Athena from the head of Zeus, from the pen of Shakhmatov alone. For all of their differences, however, there is at least one trait that the two camps share in common. No matter which side of the debate scholars find themselves on, whether nodding with the faithful or objecting with the unbelieving, The words and ideas of one man are almost always at the center of attention. Indeed, one sometimes gets the sense that the entire history of the field is but a footnote to Shakhmatov. Couple this with the particularly partisan atmosphere of Russian academic culture, and one is left with the impression that neutrality is simply not an option. One is either with Shakhmatov and his school or against them. But a choice must be made, a flag must be planted. There can be no agnostics on the field of philological battle. Yet in my first book, all right, now we're going to get to my research. Sorry, everybody. Plug. Yet in my first book, I remained an agnostic. And here's why. My research uncovered the liturgical sources of the Rus Primary Chronicle. The chroniclers of medieval Rus were monks who celebrated the divine services of the Byzantine Church throughout every day. And ultimately, this one rather obvious observation meant that there was no need for me to choose a side. As far as my findings were concerned, it did not matter whether the Rus Primary Chronicle was compiled in 1118, 1095, 1073, 1039, 1017, 996, or any other hypothetical date. Likewise, it does not matter whether it was the creation of a single scribe working at a single time in a single place, or the work of many scribes laboring in many locales over the course of many centuries. Nor does it matter who was the reigning prince, or who was the ruling bishop, or which way the political winds happened to be blowing. In early Rus, these things were temporary and ever-shifting. The liturgical services of the Byzantine Empire were not. Princes, bishops, and chroniclers came and went, but the services of the Byzantine Rite remained virtually unchanged. In every era, at every stage of the chronicle's making, clerics prayed essentially the same prayers, sang roughly the same songs, and celebrated basically the same liturgical feasts. Daily immersion in the divine services thereby ensured that every generation of chroniclers received a nearly identical education in sacred history. Through ritual repetition, every generation learned the same liturgical narratives. Through ritual continuity, every generation experienced the same liturgical past. The sacred rites therefore shaped not only the original composition of the chronicle, whenever and however that may have occurred, they also continuously shaped how the text was understood and edited for centuries afterwards. So once we begin to view the issue in these terms, it becomes clear that a lacuna does indeed exist in the critical literature. And I mean, this lacuna is what my book is all about. For nearly 250 years, scholars have meticulously sought out and identified the materials comprising the Rus Primary Chronicle. They have speculated about non-extant svodi. They have reconstructed hypothetical texts, theorized about long-lost earlier tales, identified a vast number of potential textual sources, and conjectured at length about the number of chroniclers and their possible identities. Yet, despite the vast literature on the subject, scholars appear to have overlooked one of the most important sources of the Rus Primary Chronicle, the liturgical services of the Byzantine Church. This oversight is even more remarkable because 70% of all surviving manuscripts from the Kievan period are translations of liturgical texts. Scholars have searched far and wide for possible sources and all but neglected the main form of native Kievan literacy, the church book. They've written hundreds of articles and published dozens of books about chronicle layers and independent tales that do not exist and that possibly never existed, while almost completely ignoring the vast majority of extant written materials. They have imagined innumerable hypothetical models for the earliest historiography and neglected the only model that we know for certain the chroniclers knew by heart, the sacred liturgical history that they chanted, prayed, and sang every day, all day long, during the celebration of the divine services. So I'm not implying here that earlier textological approaches are therefore irrelevant, unnecessary, or inaccurate. I wish only to draw attention to an aspect of early medieval society, to a narrative ritual technology imported from the Byzantines that has yet to be considered in the scholarly literature. And to learn more about those ideas and discoveries, you'll have to read my book. So thank you for your time and attention. And again, my thanks to the Russian History Museum for the kind invitation to speak with you today.
So Nikolai wants to hear a little more about your theory that you presented in your book. And he says that the chronicles are not church texts. Those don't have this historical aspect, probably. Can you give an example of what you mean by your theory? Can you just speak maybe a little more?
Sure.
About
So Nikolai, first thing, you got to read my book. But yes, if what you're pointing out is, well, hold on, Sean, there's all of this parts of the Chronicles that have nothing to do with the liturgy. Oh, of course you're right. Yes. But the stories I focus on are the part that I call the myth of Christian origins for Rus. So this is the baptism and burial of Princess Olga, the conversion of Prince Vladimir, the mass baptism of Rus, um, and the martyrdom of Princes Boris and Gleb. So, and I mean, what I showed in like excruciating philological detail, like this, the second half of my book is gets like very, very, very like serious and scholarly, and maybe a little boring. But I basically spent years parsing these texts and just painstakingly showing like, okay, this line comes from this liturgical service, and this line comes from this liturgical service, and this. So actually, parts of the Chronicle are deeply, densely comprised of direct citations from liturgical services. The most probably, I mean, there's a few examples that come to mind. And again, I point you to my book because all of this is really explained in great detail in the book. But for instance, in the panegyric to Princess Olga at her burial, there's all of these citations that come from liturgical texts. And the point that the chronicler is trying to make is like, look, they're trying to turn Olga into both the Saint John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christianity of Rus, as well as like kind of the Slavic Mary. Because basically, what the Rus chroniclers had to do was take all of the kind of the patterns, the models of sacred history, which are contained in the liturgical services, and compress them into the history of this one, dynasty, this one family, which was by no means an easy task, and they actually did a pretty good job of it. Some of my other most famous examples, the prayers that Prince Vladimir plays, or Volodymyr, when he goes into the waters of Kiev to baptize his people. Those prayers are straight from, or largely based on the prayers that a bishop prays. I think both at the consecration of a church and during the baptism service itself. And then my favorite one, when Prince Vladimir when he consecrates the Church of the Tithes, he goes into the church and he says exactly the prayer that only a bishop can pray during a service. Lord, look down at this vineyard which thine own hand hath planted. And so I made this very, very provocative argument in the book, which a lot of people didn't like, that actually I believe that Prince Vladimir is depicted as the first bishop of Rus. I don't mean this actually historically, like no way that was what it really was, but there is some pretty compelling evidence that the chronicler was really kind of depicting him as a bishop. And there was ancient precedent for this, because this is in many ways the way that the liturgical services for St. Constantine and Helen depict St. Constantine. So if you're interested in all that stuff, take a look at the book. If you're not convinced, that's okay too.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Denise. Has the political manipulation of the chronicles been more prevalent now than former time? So I guess we talk about the political agenda in modern Russia. And what role does the chronicle play? You briefly mentioned in the beginning, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about it, how it's mythologized and all the things.
Sure. Okay. So this is a part of the book that I'm working on right now, and I wrote an article called Revolution, Raskol, and Rock and Roll, the 120th anniversary of the baptism of Rus, which was in the Russian Review a few years ago. I'd point you toward that if you want the longer explanation. But off the top of my head, I can tell you a couple of things. I would say chronicles have always existed as a source and a means of political manipulation. Like, why did the Rus Primary Chronicle get written? To sacralize Yaroslav the Wise's dynasty's family claims to power, right? Because scholars have long known that politics and religion in the early Middle Ages are so deeply intertwined that they cannot be separated. Writing chronicles was really expensive. There was not very many people that were trained to do it. Building churches, employing a professional clerical elite was really expensive. Why did a bunch of silver-seeking Varangians from the Nordic North, why, when they got to Kiev, did they decide to invest in all of this Byzantine infrastructure, right? Both in terms of history writing and in terms of the church. Well, what I argue in the book, and I got accused in some of the reviews of the book of this was like my interpretation was like straight out of like the atheist handbook from the Soviet Union. But the argument I make is that they did this because they imported an imperial Roman political technology that sacralized the dynasty's grip on power, right? You can't revolt against your leader if your leader is chosen by God. And that is what the Chronicles basically show. So that, and in current times, in a way, Putin and Kirill are oftentimes kind of doing the same things. And this is what my new book is about. And so when it comes out, everybody should read it. But yeah, they are. I mean, and guys, This has not just happened in Russia. This has not just happened in Ukraine. This happens everywhere, right? Like this is what scholars usually call memory politics or the politics of memory, right? Like, why do we invent these imaginary pasts? We invent these imaginary pasts to create a version of political order that we want in the present. And basically, all ruling elites in all countries through the course of history have done this. So it is certainly not just an Eastern European or Russian phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Coming back to the question of authorship, there is a question from an anonymous attendee. Dr. Griffin, do you think there was an actual Nestor? Uh, do we know anything
No,
about his past, or like is there a grave or something? Because when you were talking about Nestor, I thought about Shakespeare and all of these theories that it's multiple authors that now we see as one person. There's definitely some parallel to Shakespeare, I guess. So do we actually know about Nestor, who he was?
great question. Well, so interestingly, I mean, I think, and I have not done like specific research on this, but as far as I'm aware, Saint Nestor is a canonized saint of the Orthodox Church, and there are icons of him. You can just Google it and find them online. And I mean, so the reason I think the Laurentian Codex, one of the early manuscripts, and sorry, it's been a while since I've studied this. I moved on to later topics. Um, one of the early chronicle texts, says it was written by Nestor. Okay, like the concluding thing, like pray for the servant of God Nestor or whatever. So there's no reason to doubt that this guy existed. I think he existed, but what generations of chronicle scholars have argued since, Schlutzer, is that he was probably just one copyist among many. And we've attributed much more importance to him than he probably ever had, right? Like he was probably almost certainly not the one who originally wrote all of these tales. Was he the first one to compile all of them? Possibly. But I think the point I was trying to make in my talk was that it's okay to just say we don't know. And when we're talking about things that happened almost 1,000 years ago, based on sources that are from about 600, 500 years ago, it's any attempt to say anything definitive is extremely precarious and hypothetical. But what is interesting is that when you get really immersed in this, like guys like Shakmatov and Schlutzer did, you tend to forget that, right? Like as St. Paul says, like we see through a glass darkly. We need to remember that we're trying, but so much has been lost to time, right? Like we're trying. These guys. I mean, Schlutzer and Shakmatov, those guys were brilliant. I mean, they were just so intelligent. Supposedly, Shakmatov had like committed to memory every surviving chronicle, right? Which is just an unbelievable achievement if he actually did that. And so, what these guys, you have to think about it. It was like it was like a gigantic mosaic, but 95% of the pieces of the mosaic were gone, or maybe 98% of the pieces of the mosaic were gone. And they were trying to figure out what the whole thing looked like based, on using the little that remained, they were trying to put together the whole mosaic. And it's a very fraught and precarious task. I think that's where I've kind of come down
Mm.
after studying this for a while.
Yeah, it's a hard task, certainly. I have a feeling that in the process of this historical memory construction, the state often intervenes and tries to simplify the narrative in order to give it more credibility. This is what basically happened with Alexander Nevsky and many other stories. And I feel like maybe with the Rus Primary Chronicle, it's also the story. So if we know the author, there is more credibility. Maybe it's just my subjective view, but maybe there is also something to that. Do you agree?
Uh, I'd have to think about it more, but one of the things you got to be careful about, and I'm guilty of this myself. Um, attributing like for yes from a contemporary vantage point, what you're saying makes perfect sense. But were they thinking about it in those terms in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries? Probably not. It doesn't mean that that phenomenon wasn't present or wasn't didn't exist. It just means that they would have never conceptualized it in that way. I'm guilty of that myself. That's something that people have criticized about my book is that, for instance, I theorize that liturgy is an imperial Roman political technology for the creating and controlling of cultural memory. And so that's me taking a lot of contemporary um, concepts like, Foucault's idea of technologies of power and kind of projecting those onto the past. Because there's a certain school in medieval studies that says you should not use any words to describe the Middle Ages that did not exist in the Middle Ages. Now, I actually think that's silly because it's like, well, should I just also write my book in Old Church Slavonic then? Again, like we have to always keep in mind how constructed this whole venture is, even if it's built on the work of many generations of previous scholars. Nadia Kijenko is asked some questions and she's like a genius. So I was reading her questions.
Okay, do you want to respond to her question?
Sure, sure. Well, she asked a good one. She's kind of put it. She's like she's throwing me a softball here because she wants me to explain it to everybody else. So she says, could you give us an example for exactly how liturgy is a source for the Chronicles, say Boris and Gleb? And do you incorporate hagiography or just liturgical texts? All right, I'll answer the first one because the second one is one of the weaknesses of my book, and she knows that. Um, okay, so Boris and Gleb. I love this part from my book. I remember when making this discovery, I was in my little apartment in Santa Monica as a grad student, and when I pieced the whole puzzle together, I got so excited. I was like in my shirt and like, shorts and it was winter. No, granted, the winters in California not that cold, but I got so excited about this. I just jumped up from my desk and ran out the door and started running up and down the streets of Santa Monica, like shouting and jumping. It was absolutely absurd. Um, but what I discovered or what I pieced together, and not everyone agrees with me about this. There was one book review that thought that I was, not correct in this interpretation, but basically, I made this argument that the entire narrative structure of the tale of Boris and Gleb. So this is, the tale about how two of Vladimir's sons, instead of defending themselves, they let themselves be killed by basically their older brother, right? And I think I showed that actually, if you look at the liturgical materials that are in this very famous tale, the materials that are used, so direct, and oftentimes it's direct citations, direct quotes from the liturgical text, they follow the exact order of how a priest prepares the host, so the bread and wine that will become the body and blood of Christ during the liturgy. The way the materials are presented, it's the exact order as if a priest is preparing the host for the Eucharistic sacrifice. So much so that at the end, when I think it's Gleb, when he's killed, it says that he is a rational sacrifice, and this is one of the things that is said about the host at like one of the climactic moments of its consecration during the liturgy of Saint Basil. So that is one very very brief example of how this all kind of works. But I should emphasize, I'm doing an absolutely terrible job of describing it. They're all massive oversimplifications. Um, and if you're really interested in this stuff, first, God bless you. And second, do take a look at my book because I think you'll find that a little more convincing than just my verbal defense of it right now.
Do we now apply any methods that were not available for the earlier scholars and try to study texts using AI, different new technologies that might potentially reveal something that a human cannot do manually?
That's a great question. People are probably doing that. I'm not one of them. Uh, if you ask, oh, I'm blanking on his name. I mean, really, the place where the best or newest discoveries about what really was early Rus, the best stuff on that is now coming out is mostly it's from archaeologists, right, who do DNA work and all sorts of stuff. So and a lot of it was actually coming out from scholars who work in the Nordic countries like Sweden and Norway and Finland in these places. They're kind of using DNA evidence to chart how the Rus, traveled south through the Eastern European waterways. Um, so they're doing that in terms of using like AI. It's funny you bring that up. At one point, I was trying to use this technology called topic modeling to look for large scale liturgical patterns in like gigantic swaths of chronicle compilation. So instead of me just doing one very tedious excavation of these liturgical sources by hand, I was going to see if at that point we weren't calling it AI, we were calling it digital humanities, which they still use that term, obviously. Um, but I got frustrated with it. It didn't really work. So perhaps in the future, maybe there. I mean, let me say this: maybe there is somebody right now doing that kind of work that I'm not aware of, and I apologize to them for my ignorance. But so far, it does not seem like the promise of digital humanities or AI is actually telling us anything we don't already know. But that doesn't mean that won't change as these technologies grow more powerful.